In 1869 Texas, a father buried his children alive, believing he was protecting their souls. The sun set slowly over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across dusty streets. In 1869, this small Texas town seemed ordinary, almost sleepy. Wooden homes lined dirt roads. Smoke curled from chimneys. Horses clopped along the town square. On the surface, life moved at a calm, predictable pace. But Willow Creek held secrets. Secrets whispered behind closed doors. Secrets that no outsider could ever imagine. The townspeople spoke of faith, of hard work, of community. Yet beneath the surface, fear and suspicion simmered quietly. Every town has its shadows. Willow Creek's were darker than most. At the center of it all lived a man named Samuel Hargrove, a widowed father, deeply devout and respected by neighbors. He carried himself with a solemn dignity, his gaze steady, his hands calloused from years of labor. People admired his faith, even envied his devotion. But there was a tension in his home that others could not see, a tension that would soon explode into tragedy. Samuel's house sat on the edge of town, near the dry creek bed that gave the town its name. The walls of the small wooden cabin seemed ordinary, yet inside, they held the echoes of sorrow and fear. Samuel lived with his 3 children, all under the age of 10. The children were lively at times, their laughter piercing the still air. But shadows lingered in their eyes. Many townsfolk noticed that the children often looked pale, as if the life had been drained from them. Neighbors whispered about the illnesses that plagued the family. Some claimed it was simple malnutrition. Others suspected fevers common in the hot Texas summers. But Samuel believed something far darker. He spoke often of the soul, of God's will, of eternal safety. To him, the world was a dangerous place. He feared the children's souls might be at risk long before their bodies failed. Life in Willow Creek moved slowly, but the air grew heavy with unspoken worry. People sensed a tension in Samuel that they could not name. He spent long hours in prayer, staring at his children in ways that made neighbors uneasy. Some wondered if grief from losing his wife had twisted his mind. Others thought perhaps he had simply gone too far in his devotions. Even the wind seemed to carry warnings. On nights when storms rolled in from the west, the howl of the wind over the dry creek sounded almost like distant voices. The children would huddle together, trembling under thin blankets, while Samuel murmured scripture in the shadows. Some townspeople claimed they could hear him talking to someone who wasn't there. Yet, despite the unease, life in Willow Creek carried on. People went to church, tended their farms, and tried to ignore the undercurrents of fear. Samuel remained a figure of respect, a man whose faith was unquestioned, whose words were taken as truth. And no one suspected the horror that was quietly taking root inside his home. Because in Willow Creek, darkness didn't announce itself. It crept, it whispered, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those we trust the most. Faith can be a comfort. Faith can be a guide. But in Samuel Hargrove's case, faith became a prison. It wrapped around his mind like thick chains, tightening with every passing day. His devotion, once admired, slowly warped into something darker. Samuel believed he was chosen to protect his children, not just in life, but in eternity. Every thought, every action revolved around safeguarding their souls. He studied scripture obsessively, reading passages late into the night by flickering candlelight. The words of the Bible were no longer guidance, they were warnings. Warnings of sin, of corruption, of eternal damnation. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes. Samuel no longer greeted them warmly at church. His eyes seemed distant, always scanning, always judging. He muttered about evil forces that could taint innocent hearts. "The world is full of sin," he would say, voice trembling. "And those who are pure must be shielded, even from life itself." His obsession grew daily. The children, once full of laughter, began to shrink from his gaze. They sensed his unease, the intensity in his voice, the trembling when he spoke of salvation. Samuel would hover over them during meals, checking if their prayers were correct, if their hearts were pure. If one child hesitated or faltered, he would sigh and shake his head, as if a great danger had just passed too close to them. Friends and relatives noticed, but few dared speak. In a town where faith was revered, questioning a man's devotion was almost blasphemous. So they whispered in shadows, hoping that Samuel's obsession would fade with time. But obsession, once rooted, does not easily die. Samuel began preparing. At first, it was small, locking windows, keeping the children inside, keeping strangers away. But soon it escalated. He built small, hidden spaces in his home, claiming they were safe rooms to protect his children from evil spirits. He measured every corner, every plank of wood, with religious precision. To him, it was not paranoia, it was duty. The intensity of his obsession began to alienate even his closest friends. Samuel's neighbors stopped inviting him to gatherings. Children avoided the Hargrove home. And yet, Samuel saw only one truth. The world outside his door was dangerous, sinful, and corrupt. And he alone could protect what mattered most. As months passed, his obsession became unstoppable. Every prayer he uttered ended with the same conclusion. Salvation could not be left to chance. The children's lives, their very souls, were fragile. The world would destroy them. And Samuel, in his mind, could prevent that destruction. What he did next would shatter Willow Creek forever. A plan, born from fear and twisted faith, began to take shape. A plan that no one could have imagined. A plan that would turn a devoted father into a monster in the eyes of history. Because sometimes the line between love and madness is thinner than a whisper, and Samuel Hargrove was about to cross it. The wind in Willow Creek carried more than dust and leaves. It carried rumors, quiet murmurs behind shutters, hesitant knocks at doors. For weeks, neighbors noticed strange things around the Hargrove house. Shadows moving in the night, candles burning at odd hours. The children's laughter replaced by long stretches of silence. People tried to convince themselves it was nothing. Small towns breed suspicion, and imagination often runs wild. Still, the whispers persisted. Mothers warned their children to stay away. Shopkeepers exchanged uneasy glances when Samuel entered the general store. Even the pastor, a man who preached understanding, began to feel a gnawing discomfort. It began subtly. Footsteps on the creaking wooden floors when no one should have been awake. Flickering lights in windows after dark. The children sometimes appeared at the doorway, pale and quiet, as if holding their breath. Some said they overheard Samuel muttering prayers that sounded wrong, almost urgent, as if trying to stop something invisible from happening. A few brave townsfolk tried to intervene. They knocked on the Hargrove door, invited Samuel to church dinners, spoke kindly of the children's health. But he smiled politely and thanked them, then returned to his home as if nothing had happened. His eyes, however, betrayed something else, an intensity that made visitors step back. There was a sense that Samuel believed himself above their concerns, that he alone carried knowledge they could not grasp. One night, a neighbor named Martha Dunn thought she heard the children crying. The sound carried faintly across the dry fields, mixing with the wind. She pressed her ear to the Hargrove fence, but the crying stopped the moment she leaned closer. When she called out, there was no answer, only the whisper of the wind in the trees. It felt as if the air itself was hiding something terrible. Rumors grew into unease, but fear kept most townspeople silent. In Willow Creek, challenging a man of faith was dangerous. People whispered in hushed tones, afraid of offending God or of provoking Samuel's wrath. So the warning stayed in shadows, carried only by whispers in the wind. Even the children seemed to sense the tension. They began to avoid neighbors' eyes, huddling close to their father as if he were both protector and predator. The lines blurred. Who was safe? Who was in danger? No one could tell. And yet, no one suspected the full horror waiting in the Hargrove home. Because the whispers in the wind were only hints, small shadows of a plan so dark that Willow Creek would never recover. As the wind howled across the plains, it seemed almost to carry a warning. But warnings are easy to ignore when faith blinds the mind, and Samuel's faith had become a storm with no eye. The children had always been frail, but in 1869, their health took a frightening turn. It started with mild fevers, restless nights, and pale cheeks. Then, one by one, they began to wither. Their small bodies shook with chills. Their tiny hands felt cold, even under blankets. The townsfolk whispered about consumption, scarlet fever, or some other unseen plague, but Samuel saw something far darker. In his mind, sickness was more than flesh and blood. It was a spiritual attack, a corruption of the soul that could steal innocence if left unchecked. Every cough, every shiver confirmed his deepest fears. The children were at risk, not just of death, but of eternal damnation. And Samuel believed that only he could intervene. He consulted local healers, tried herbal remedies, even prayed for hours at a time. But nothing worked fast enough. The children's suffering fed his obsession. Night after night, he watched them sleep, or appear to sleep, listening for any sign of a faltering soul. Each time a child stirred or moaned, Samuel's heart raced. Was it a symptom of sickness or a sign of spiritual decay? Neighbors noticed the change. Children rarely played outside. School visits were sparse. The house grew quieter, almost oppressive. Some mothers peered through windows and saw Samuel pacing, muttering scripture, sometimes placing his hands over the children's chests, as if performing a ritual they could not understand. The illness worsened. The youngest, little Anna, had trouble swallowing. Her cough was relentless, and at times she seemed barely there. Samuel refused outside help, claiming that doctors could not touch the soul. Only he could protect it. His fear morphed into a single, consuming thought. The world outside his home was too dangerous. Every second spent outside God's protection threatened the children's salvation. Friends tried to intervene. A cousin came with medicines, urging Samuel to let the children see a doctor. But Samuel would not hear it. He spoke of angels, of protection, of eternal consequences. To him, human intervention was meaningless, even dangerous. Faith alone would save them, but only if he acted decisively. As the illnesses progressed, the house fell into a strange rhythm. Candlelight flickered against the walls at odd hours. Whispered prayers filled the rooms. The children, weak and fearful, began to sense the intensity of Samuel's obsession. They recoiled from his hands, yet they could not escape his gaze. In his mind, every act of care was an act of salvation. In theirs, it was suffocating. It was a sickness that fed fear, fear that fed obsession, obsession that set the stage for the unimaginable. The illnesses were not just attacking the body. They were warping the mind of the Father tasked with saving them. And in the shadows of Willow Creek, a plan began to take root, one that would blur the line between protection and horror. The stage was set. The children were fragile, the father consumed, and the town oblivious. The darkest night in Willow Creek was approaching. In Willow Creek, cautionary words were often buried beneath fear and respect. The townspeople noticed Samuel's obsession growing, but no one dared confront it directly. Faith was revered, and to question a devout man was almost sacrilege. So the warnings went unheard, dismissed as gossip or overactive imagination. Neighbors whispered about the strange nights, about the children huddled together, eyes wide in silent fear, about the father pacing, muttering scripture to walls no one else could see. Some suggested the town elders intervene, but each suggestion was met with hesitation. "He's a man of God," they said. "Surely he knows what he's doing." Even the closest friends of the Hargroves ignored the signs. A cousin who had once been a frequent visitor stopped coming. A neighbor who had known Samuel since childhood avoided his house entirely. No one wanted to challenge the father of three in a town where reputation and piety meant everything. And so Samuel's obsession grew unchecked. Every cough, every fever in the children became a confirmation of his fears. Every hesitation in prayer, every tiny act of disobedience became proof that the world was conspiring to corrupt their souls. The warnings that might have saved the children were all ignored. One evening, a traveling preacher came to town. He stayed briefly in Willow Creek, visiting homes and offering prayers. He asked about the Hargroves. When told of Samuel's devotion, he frowned but said nothing. A man so consumed by fear may see angels and demons where none exist, he whispered to a friend, already sensing the danger. But by the time his words reached anyone who could act, Samuel's plans were already forming. Even the children themselves tried to warn others in their own way. Small gestures, silent looks, and whispered pleas to neighbors went unnoticed. People told themselves the children were tired, or sick, or simply shy. They didn't understand that the danger came from the person who loved them most. By ignoring the warnings, Willow Creek became complicit. Fear of offending God and respect for Samuel's devotion allowed the seeds of tragedy to grow. The town's silence, though unintentional, gave him free rein. And with the warnings drowned in whispers, Samuel's mind moved from fear to action. He was no longer merely a concerned father. He was a man convinced that only extreme measures could save his children. The world outside his cabin was a threat. Time was running out, and the horrific decision that would mark Willow Creek forever was now inevitable. The storm was coming, and no one saw it approaching, not even those who thought they were watching closely. The night was unusually still in Willow Creek. The cicadas had fallen silent. The air was thick with heat, carrying the faint scent of dust and wildflowers. Inside the Hargrove cabin, candlelight flickered against the walls, casting dancing shadows. Samuel moved quietly, deliberately, preparing for a task he believed was holy. His children slept, unaware of the fate their father had decided for them. Pale faces pressed against thin pillows, small chests rising and falling with fragile breaths. Samuel's hands trembled, not with fear, but with devotion. Each movement was measured, ritualistic, as if guided by divine instruction. In his mind, this night was salvation. In reality, it was horror. Neighbors nearby might have heard the soft sounds of shovels scraping against dry earth or the whisper of a father's prayers. But most slept, oblivious to the acts unfolding just beyond the town square. The Hargrove home seemed quiet from the outside, but inside, terror and faith intertwined in ways that no one could comprehend. Samuel led his children one by one to the prepared graves behind the cabin, small mounds freshly dug under the shadow of the mesquite trees. He spoke softly, explaining that they were being taken to a safer place, a place where no evil could touch them. The children, confused and frightened, sensed the urgency but did not understand. Their tiny hands were held with what Samuel considered care, but what was in truth the grip of doom. By the time the first child was placed in the earth, the night had deepened. A heavy wind whispered through the trees, rattling leaves against the cabin walls. Samuel chanted prayers over the small form, insisting the act was necessary to protect the soul from corruption. His eyes, wide and intense, reflected the flickering candlelight like twin flames. The second and third children followed. The quiet was punctuated only by the soft, stifled whimpers of the youngest, a sound that would haunt anyone who heard it. Samuel's mind blocked out the reality of what he was doing, convinced that eternity mattered more than the fleeting lives before him. By the time the burials were complete, the ground had been pressed and the graves smoothed. Samuel returned to the cabin, exhausted yet serene. He spoke aloud to the empty rooms, reciting scripture and comforting himself that the children were now safe. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echoes of a town sleeping peacefully, unaware of the horror just beyond their doors. No one would intervene that night. No one would know the truth until the morning sun revealed it. And when the discovery came, it would shock Willow Creek to its very core. Samuel Hargrove had crossed a line from which there was no return. Faith, once his guide, had become a weapon, and the night of the burials would become a story whispered through generations, an unthinkable act that no parent should ever commit. Morning came slowly over Willow Creek, the sun rising in streaks of gold that cut across dusty streets and wooden homes. Birds chirped, merchants opened their shops, and life carried on as if the world had not shifted overnight. But for one neighbor, life would never feel the same. Martha Dunn, the woman who had once pressed her ear to the Hargrove fence, noticed something unusual that morning. The ground behind the Hargrove cabin seemed disturbed, the earth darker in patches, as if freshly turned. She hesitated, heart pounding. The whispers of the wind, which had always carried a sense of unease, now seemed urgent, warning her that something terrible had occurred. Curiosity overrode fear. Martha crept closer, eyes wide, breath shallow. She noticed small depressions in the earth, arranged in an orderly pattern. Her hands shook as she ran them over the loose soil. A faint, almost imperceptible smell reached her: earth, sweat, and something else. Something sickly sweet and wrong. Word spread quickly through the town. Neighbors gathered, voices trembling, eyes scanning the ground. They had feared Samuel's obsession, but none had imagined this. As the soil was carefully moved, the horrifying truth emerged. Samuel's children, lifeless, small forms, buried alive under the shadow of his home. Panic and disbelief rippled through Willow Creek like wildfire. The townspeople could barely comprehend what they saw. The children, innocent and fragile, had been taken from the world in the name of salvation. Tears fell freely as parents clutched each other, whispers turning into cries of anger and grief. Samuel Hargrove, once a respected man of faith, was confronted by the community he had long been part of. He stood quietly, almost detached, murmuring prayers and explanations that sounded hollow to everyone else. "They're safe now," he said, voice calm. "Their souls are protected. They will not suffer in the world that is sinful." His words struck the town like a thunderclap. Protection had become horror. Faith had become cruelty. Sheriff Thompson arrived soon after, solemn and stern. Samuel was taken into custody, his hands unresisting, his eyes still fixed on the graves, as if he could still see beyond them. The children were gently removed from the earth, and the townspeople struggled to wrap their minds around the atrocity. How could a father, a man of faith, commit such an act? How could their quiet neighbor have crossed the line between love and madness? Willow Creek would never be the same. Mothers wept openly. Children clung to their families, fear lingering where it had never existed before. And the story of the Hargrove children, buried alive by the hand of the one who should have protected them, spread through the region, a cautionary tale of obsession, faith, and the fragility of trust. Even years later, the dust behind the Hargrove cabin was said to whisper at night, carrying the echoes of grief and unanswered questions. And Willow Creek, once quiet and calm, had been forever changed. The trial of Samuel Hargrove gripped Willow Creek like a storm. The courthouse, a small wooden building at the center of town, was packed with townsfolk, neighbors, and curious visitors from nearby settlements. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted to understand how a man of faith could commit an act so horrifying. The courtroom was heavy with tension. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and candle smoke. Samuel sat quietly at the defendant's table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. He did not plead, did not cry, did not show fear. To him, the trial was a formality. He had acted out of love. He had acted out of duty. And in his mind, no punishment could undo what he believed was necessary. The prosecution painted a vivid picture of terror. Witnesses described the obsessive behavior, the whispered warnings, the illnesses, and ultimately the night the children were buried alive. Their testimony was filled with grief, anger, and disbelief. Mothers wept openly as they recounted the horror. Fathers shook their heads in stunned silence. Every word reinforced the town's sense of betrayal, of innocence destroyed. Samuel's defense was simple but chilling. He spoke softly, calmly, claiming that his actions were necessary to save the souls of his children. He argued that the world was dangerous, that sin and evil threatened their purity, and that only through his intervention could they be protected. The judge listened, the jury listened, the town listened, and yet to them his logic sounded hollow, a twisted version of love. Moral debates erupted. Some argued that Samuel's intent was pure, that he acted out of devotion, and that the punishment should reflect a man misled by faith, not a cold-blooded killer. Others demanded the harshest justice, insisting that no degree of religious fervor could justify taking the lives of innocent children. The courtroom became a battlefield of belief, law, and morality. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Samuel Hargrove was found guilty of murder. The sentence, though severe, was tempered by acknowledgement of his mental state. In the eyes of the law, he had committed an unthinkable act, yet his obsession with faith complicated the question of culpability. The town struggled to reconcile justice with mercy, knowing that punishment could not bring back the lives he had taken. Even as Samuel was led away, some in Willow Creek whispered that he had acted out of love, that he had truly believed he was saving his children. Others, however, could not forgive, could not understand, and would never forget the horror of that night. The trial closed, but the moral questions lingered, haunting the town like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Willow Creek had glimpsed the terrifying intersection of faith, obsession, and human frailty. And the question remained, how much devotion becomes madness before it becomes crime? After the trial, Samuel Hargrove became a figure wrapped in eerie silence. In prison, he spoke little. He ate slowly, prayed often, and stared at empty walls as if they held secrets only he could see. He did not complain. He did not cry. He did not ask for forgiveness. To him, there was no crime, only a duty fulfilled. Visitors who came hoping for answers were met with calm, distant eyes. He would explain that the children were safe in the hands of God, that their souls were beyond corruption. He seemed at peace, almost serene, and yet that serenity was unsettling. It hinted at a mind that had truly convinced itself of righteousness, a mind detached from the reality of human suffering. The townspeople, meanwhile, struggled with the silence. How could a man commit such horror and remain so composed? Some visited him, seeking closure, but left shaken. Others avoided him entirely, unable to face the man who had once been a neighbor, a member of the community, a father. His quietude became a mirror reflecting their own grief, fear, and confusion. Samuel's silence carried weight beyond words. It forced Willow Creek to confront uncomfortable truths. Faith, once a source of comfort, had been twisted into a weapon. Obsession, unchecked, had led to unimaginable tragedy, and the quiet acceptance in his eyes reminded everyone that he believed he had done nothing wrong. Letters he wrote to distant relatives revealed a mind still consumed by protection and divine purpose. He described his actions as necessary, righteous, unavoidable. There was no remorse for the pain inflicted on the living, only certainty that the children were safe in the afterlife. Each word underscored the chilling reality. He could not, and would not, see himself as a villain. The silence became a legacy. It haunted the town more than any courtroom or punishment ever could. Even after years passed, whispers of Samuel's calm demeanor persisted, a reminder that horror sometimes walks quietly, unannounced, and often comes from those we trust the most. Willow Creek was left to grapple with this paradox. A father's love, twisted by fear and devotion, had destroyed the very lives he sought to protect. And through it all, Samuel's silence endured, a haunting echo of faith gone too far. Willow Creek never returned to the quiet it once knew. The tragedy of the Hargrove children lingered in every corner, every street, every home. Even years later, Mothers held their children closer, and fathers watched the shadows more carefully. The town had glimpsed the fragility of innocence and the terrifying power of obsession. Stories of that night were told quietly, in hushed voices, around hearths and at church. Children grew up hearing of the father who buried his own children alive, a man whose love had become a weapon. The names of Anna, Thomas, and little Clara were remembered not as ordinary children of Willow Creek, but as symbols of a horror that had come from within. Even the Hargrove cabin, long abandoned, became a place of silent warning. The wind seemed to moan through its broken windows. Travelers claimed to hear small, fleeting cries carried across the fields, as if the earth itself refused to forget. Families avoided the land behind the cabin, wary of stepping too close to the graves that had once held innocent lives. The trial, the burials, and Samuel's silence left scars on the town's collective memory. Faith, once a unifying force, became a double-edged sword, a reminder that devotion can easily slip into madness when unchecked. Neighbors questioned one another, wondering how well they truly knew the people around them, how easily appearances could hide darkness. Historians who later chronicled Willow Creek noted the change. The town became cautious, protective, and wary. Stranger children were watched closely. Parents spoke openly about mental health and the danger of obsession, even if the terminology was different. The tragedy shaped generations, imprinting a wariness that could not be erased. And yet, despite the sorrow, life continued. Children played, crops were planted, and the seasons changed. But the memory of that night remained, a shadow over Willow Creek that refused to lift. A reminder that one person's fear, twisted by faith, could destroy the lives of those they loved most. Even now, when the wind rustles the mesquite trees along the dry creek, it carries a whisper of the past, a silent warning. Willow Creek is a town forever changed, haunted by the echoes of grief, the burden of unanswered questions, and the tragic story of a father who believed he was saving his children's souls.